Do you remember when you were stuck inside for days and days on end when it was COVID? We all almost collectively went insane. Now imagine doing that for years on end. That is just a glimpse of what serving a life sentence would look like. Some of these people spend their entire youth behind bars, never knowing the simple experiences of a normal life. In this video, I bring you the stories of female inmates who outlived their sentences. Betty Smithy. Betty Smithy walked into prison in 1963 with a life sentence and no chance of parole. To put that into perspective, she went to prison when John F. Kennedy was president. She served 49 years in prison before finally being released in 2012. Her childhood was just a series of unfortunate events. Her father died when she was only 4 years old, and this left her plus her 7 sisters in the care of their impoverished mother. However, the state deemed their mother unfit to provide for them, resulting in the girls being placed under state custody and separated from each other. Unfortunately, most of them never had the opportunity to reunite. At the age of 8, Smithy was adopted by a family that subjected her to physical abuse, causing her to move from one foster home to another, which had a negative impact on her physical and mental health. Her being in the foster system subjected her to emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. These traumatic events had a lasting impact on her mental health and behavior, which carried on to her adult life. In 1953, at a previous job as a babysitter, Smithy made the regrettable decision to run away with her employer's 18-month-old son, Mitchell Johnson, in New Mexico, resulting in her conviction for kidnapping and a 4-year sentence in a juvenile prison. In 1963, Betty was a 20-year-old live-in babysitter for the Gerberick family, and on New Year's Day she would strangle and murder their 15-month-old baby daughter, Sandy Gerberick, in her own home. Betty was caught the next day. On July 10, 1963, she was charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. She was allegedly led from the courtroom shouting, "I'm not going to prison, I'll kill myself, you watch," and later made 4 escape attempts between the years 1974 and 1981. But it was 20 years after the murder when she was truly inspired to turn her life around. In 1983, Sandy Gerberick's mother, Emma Simmons, wrote her a letter. Emma wrote that she forgave Betty for what happened, and this had a very profound impact on Betty. "She made me feel that I wasn't a monster."
If she could do that, then it was my responsibility to try and become a better person than the person that I was. And ever since that I received that letter, I started slowly turning things around.
Betty stopped trying to escape from the prison and avoided the consequences of her actions. As a result, her disciplinary record improved significantly. She actively participated in self-improvement courses and successfully obtained her GED certification. Moreover, she even completed 52 college-level credit hours until the Department of Corrections abruptly ended the program. She also published a collection of poems as part of a prison writing workshop in 1993, although the workshop no longer exists. She also gradually freed herself from relying on the antipsychotic medications that were prescribed to her when she entered the prison system. Over the years, Betty had submitted several appeals, but they went unfulfilled for decades under an Arizona law that basically says a life sentence means a sentence, and according to the law at the time she was sentenced, only a governor could grant her clemency. After many unsuccessful attempts, finally in 2012, Betty Smithy was granted clemency by Arizona Governor Jan Brewer. Despite serving 49 years in prison, she says that she will forever be remorseful and never be able to forget what she did.
That's something that you can't forget, and you should not forget, that somebody died because of me and because of what I did.
After being released at the age of 69, Betty Smithy struggled to adapt to a changed world after nearly 50 years behind bars. With help from loved ones, she settled into life outside prison. She lived in Tucson, Arizona with her daughter and son-in-law, actively engaging in community work. Betty volunteered at a local church and gave speeches to at-risk youth about the perils of substance abuse. Sadly, she passed away on October 11, 2021, at 87. Mary Virginia Jones. Is the accomplice just as guilty as the criminal? Mary Virginia Jones was a woman who was sentenced to life in prison for being an accomplice to a murder in 1981 committed by her abusive boyfriend, Mose Willis. Mary was known for her commitment to her faith. She was a church-going woman who also worked as a teacher's aide. She had never been involved in any legal trouble and had a clean reputation. However, just a few months before the incident, she met Mose Willis. Mose was homeless when they met, and Mary showed him kindness and compassion when he said that he wanted to turn his life around. She offered him a place to stay stay, took him to church, and supported him as he got his life together, which he promised her he would. However, Mose turned out to be abusive and violent to the point that Mary feared for her and her daughter's lives on multiple occasions. 1 week before the shooting incident, Willis fired a gun at Mary's daughter, Denitra Jones Goody, and warned that he would kill them if they chose to involve the police, and he would kill anyone else they tried to get help from. And Mary believed he was capable of doing that, so she obeyed him. Mary's daughter later recounted the incident. "He pulled a gun on me and shot at me, and my mother witnessed that, and he threatened to not only kill me, but to kill her and anybody else that came to our aid." In 1981 in Los Angeles, Mose Willis kidnapped 2 drug dealers and ordered Mary to be the driver as he dealt with them. He held a gun to her head and ordered her to drive the car into a back alley. He proceeded to rob and shoot the 2 men, killing one of them, while Mary took this chance to run away. Both Mary and Mose were caught by authorities later on. Mary was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. She was sentenced to life without parole, while her boyfriend was sentenced to death row. Mary had tried many times to appeal her sentence as she considered it unjust given her circumstances. She argued that even as she ran away from him in that alley, she fully expected him to shoot and kill her next. She maintained throughout her incarceration that she was not a willing participant and was forced at gunpoint to help him. In the midst of her incarceration and legal battles, her abusive ex-boyfriend died while on death row. Her case was reopened and taken seriously after law students at USC's Post-Conviction Justice Project opposed the sentencing. The students argued that she had been a victim of battered women syndrome, which is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that can cause a victim to feel trapped, helpless, and unable to escape their abuser. They argued that during her trial, her defense attorney had demonstrated incompetence by failing to consider the crucial factors of her domestic abuse situation and the imminent threats to her and her daughter's safety, all of which led to her becoming an accomplice. She would not have been convicted if the jury had heard expert testimony about the impact of battered women syndrome. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office reviewed the case and agreed to set aside her convictions if she pled no contest to voluntary manslaughter, which she agreed to do, and her sentence was changed from first-degree murder to voluntary manslaughter. Mary had already served a sentence of 32 years, but only 11.8 of them were considered during the sentencing, but thankfully they still exceeded the maximum term of 11 years for the crime of voluntary manslaughter, which made her eligible for release from custody.
To sit back and hear the days be converted down to like 11 years after she had done 32, it almost seems like an injustice, but we're so happy to have her out that we'll take anything.
And on March 25, 2014, Mary Virginia Jones, now 74 years old, walked out of Century Regional Detention Facility in Linwood finally free. Jones's reunion with her family was a very joyful moment. For 32 years, her children had lived without their mother. Her son, Robert Jones Jr., was especially happy as he had been unable to see her during 3 decades of her incarceration because of a felony conviction in 1979. Their unwavering determination to reopen their mother's case had finally paid off, and they could not contain their happiness. After being released from prison, she expressed her heartfelt appreciation to the law students who had played a crucial role in securing her freedom. Gloria Williams. Gloria Williams had been incarcerated for 51 years in prison, making her the longest-serving inmate we have on our list. She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gloria married her first husband in 1960 when she was only 14 years old. The marriage didn't work out and they went their separate ways, but he took custody of their children and gave them to his father and stepmother. She had limited financial resources and only a 5th-grade education, so she faced many challenges in her custody battle and couldn't properly fight for children. Her attorney advised her that courts look at the stability of the household before granting custody. So acting on his advice, she entered into a marriage with her current partner, W.C. Williams, in an attempt to present a more stable family dynamic to the courts. However, that decision took a turn for the worse. Williams turned out to be very abusive and controlling. He subjected her to heroin injections and was physically abusive. One time he shot her in the hand and threatened her children with a firearm. Gloria, after a while, attempted to leave her abusive husband, but before she could successfully do so, she was abducted and assaulted by an unknown individual, whom she believed acted under her husband's instructions. She claims that even after her husband's arrest and subsequent imprisonment for armed robbery in 1970, the terror persisted. The fear he had over her never went away. Through a mutual acquaintance, he told her to get money to hire a lawyer in his case. He also made sure to warn her of dire consequences if she failed to fulfill his demands. So to fulfill his demands, in February 1971, Gloria traveled to Louisiana accompanied by 2 two other individuals. During their stay in Louisiana, they devised a plan to rob a grocery store using a toy gun and a fake rifle. However, their scheme took an unexpected turn when they entered the store. The store owner, Budge Cutrera, was armed, and a struggle ensued. Gloria's 16-year-old accomplice ultimately shot and killed Cutrera with his own gun. The three were arrested and 9 months later sentenced in a St. Landry Parish courtroom to life without parole. During her initial 3-year incarceration at LCIW, Gloria attempted to escape 3 times. In 1973, she successfully fled to Houston, but was caught for armed robbery and sentenced to 8 years in a Texas prison. While there, she earned her GED and cosmetology license. In 1982, she was transferred back to LCIW to resume serving her life sentence. In 1985, she made a 4th escape attempt by slugging a guard with a sock full of billiard balls and tried to walk out, but she was subdued by the guards and was put in solitary confinement for 10 years. In 1995, a deputy warden advocated for her release from solitary confinement, and she rejoined the general population. She became involved with the prison ministry and Big Sisters mentoring program and was a member of the drama club, in which long-termers mentor newly arrived women. Through her counseling and mentoring, she became a mother figure for the inmates, earning the nickname Mama Glow. She was known for her kindness and compassion towards the newly arrived women, and she provided them with guidance and support as they adjusted to life in prison. Gloria's mother died while she was still in prison, and she was unable to be present at her funeral. She claimed she was forever indebted to her mother for raising her children while she was in prison. In July 2019, she appeared before the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Paroles, who unanimously recommended that Governor John Bell Edwards commute her sentence, making her immediately eligible for parole. More than 2 years after the parole board's recommendation, the governor officially commuted Gloria's sentence, allowing her to be considered for parole. During this time, she contracted the COVID-19 virus twice and was in danger of losing her life, but she remained strong. In 2022, she participated in a Zoom hearing attended by 3 parole board members and Cutrera's son, and she was granted parole. Initially, the Cutrera family opposed her release, claiming that she had never shown remorse for her actions. However, they were informed during the trial that her lack of communication with them was due to the state's prohibition on contact between them. Finally, on January 25, 2022, after serving 51 years in prison, Gloria Williams was free. Judith Clark. You may have wondered, does prison end up helping anyone? I can't speak for everyone, but in Judith Clark's case, it did. Judith was just a student at the University of Chicago when she joined the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society organizations, and had gotten involved in left-wing protests. The protests progressively got out of hand, and she was thrown out of the university. She went down the radical arc from being a student protester to becoming a member of the Weathermen, a far-left militant organization that was active in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Weathermen were known for their radical views and their involvement in violent protests and bombings. Judith was a member of an offshoot part of them called the May 19th Communist Organization. She embraced their ideals and was soon involved in their activities. In October 1969, a series of anti-war protests were organized by the Weathermen organization. From October 8th to 11, 1969, Weathermen worked to organize thousands of young people in a direct assault on the police, whom they called pigs. The group called this a national action, but newspapers called it Days of Rage. Judith Clark actively participated in an anti-war protest that unfortunately turned violent. The mob proceeded to smash windows and get into confrontations with law enforcement. She was one of many individuals arrested for mob action during the demonstration. After being charged with rioting, Judith went into hiding but was eventually caught by the FBI while watching a movie in Manhattan. She served a 9-month prison sentence as a result. The Days of Rage was a turning point for the Weather as they became more militant and violent in their tactics. In 1981, a group comprising of members from the Weatherman M19CO and the Black Liberation Army robbed a Brinks armored truck of $1.6 million at the Nanuet Mall in New York. The robbers killed security guard Peter Page and seriously wounded Brinks guard Joseph Trombino. During the getaway, the robbers killed 2 Nyack police officers, Edward O'Grady and Waverly Brown, and seriously wounded police detective Artie Keenan. Judith and her 2 companions were arrested when she crashed the car. She tried to lure police officers from behind their vehicles as she reached for a gun, but it didn't work. During their trial, she and her 3 accomplices refused to be represented by someone else claiming themselves to be prisoners of war. When they refused to comply with court decorum, they were placed in cells. They were convicted of 3 counts of felony murder and were each sentenced to 25 years to life sentences. In the early years of her incarceration, Judith Clark remained defiant and unwavering in her radical, revolutionary beliefs. She consistently refused to accept responsibility for her actions and maintained a confrontational stance. However, as time went on, she experienced a remarkable transformation. She wholeheartedly dedicated herself to rehabilitation and was genuinely committed to making amends for her past wrongdoing. She trained service dogs that were later employed by law enforcement agencies. She also taught prenatal care to mother inmates, helping and guiding them wherever necessary. She also took the initiative to establish an AIDS counseling program within the prison community. She took on the role of a mentor and mother figure for the new inmates. In her own account, Judith admits that in the initial years of her incarceration, she did not immediately grasp the seriousness of the deaths she had played a part in. Instead, her initial thoughts centered around her revolutionary principles and her status as a political prisoner. However, as time passed, she realized the gravity of her actions. She sincerely expressed remorse for her previous indifference, acknowledging that her self-assured and unemotional attitude must have inflicted anguish upon the survivors of the victims who had tragically lost their beloved ones. Despite her transition from a radical revolutionary to an exemplary inmate, many people still wanted her to stay in prison. In 2017, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo commuted Judith Clark's sentence, marking her eligible for parole, but she denied parole. The members of the parole board have determined that despite their recognition of her rehabilitation, she must remain incarcerated due to the gravity of her offense and the opposition expressed by the public toward her release. More than 10,000 New Yorkers submitted their signatures in opposition to parole for Judith. She was granted parole in 2019, and finally, in April 2019, after serving nearly 38 years in prison, Judith Clark was released from prison. Irena Pretty. Irena Pretty is probably the youngest one to be convicted of a crime on this list. She was only 18 when she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison along with her boyfriend. Irena grew up in a poor and abusive home. When she turned 18, she met her boyfriend, Ronald Brown. He was 5 years older than her and turned out to be a toxic and abusive man.
I was a scared kid. All I wanted was attention. I wanted somebody to love me.
Her boyfriend was involved in another murder a few months prior of a social worker, Lewis Thomas. She was later accused of disposing of the murder weapon for Ronald. A few months later, on April 6, 1978, Brown ordered Irena to help him rob the store she previously worked at. She had recently quit her job at the store. Ronald told her that since the owner knew her, he would open the back door for her, allowing Ronald and his accomplice to carry out the robbery while she tied him up.
The pain is that when my boyfriend told me to tie them up, and I saw it in their eyes, they didn't want. They said, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. And I told them to just listen to what he tells them to do, and nobody was going to die.
Unfortunately, during the robbery, he violently did away with the owner, execution style. Later, all 3 individuals involved were arrested by the police. In 1978, considering the advice from her lawyer and the possibility of facing the death penalty, Irena agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder. She made this decision assuming that a life sentence with the chance of parole would mean she would be imprisoned for 20 to 25 years at max. However, she was sentenced to 60 years to life in prison. Irena Pretty has expressed remorse for her involvement in the crime and has worked to rehabilitate herself during her time in prison.
2003, I wrote Governor Early and asked him for lethal injection.
You asked?
Yes, because of the victim's family and everybody. I wanted them to know that I was sorry for the crime that I had committed.
Throughout the course of her 42 years of incarceration, Irena has seen her daughter, Keisha Dunn, as well as her grandchildren, grow up from their early childhood to adulthood, solely through visits to the correctional facility. She has used her guilt as motivation to better herself and turn her life around. She obtained her bachelor's degree in sociology from Morgan State University and actively engaged in various self-help and counseling groups. She also completed courses in pre-employment job readiness, personal computing, and introduction to databases. She became a mentor for the new inmates, encouraging them to participate in prison programming, and at times, even talking them out of fighting. However, despite these notable accomplishments, none of them proved influential in the parole proceedings.
Nice to be freed, but just give me a second chance, because I have done so much to better myself.
She was first recommended for parole in 2008, but no governor granted it, and in May 2020, Irena was admitted to the hospital with COVID-19, prompting advocates and lawmakers to advocate for her release from prison due to concerns surrounding the potential transmission of the virus within correctional facilities. Subsequently, in December 2020, a Baltimore Circuit Court judge acknowledged Irena's diligent efforts and commitment to personal growth. The judge recognized her remorse for her past actions and her successful rehabilitation, deeming her no longer a danger to society. Finally, after a 42-year incarceration, Irena Pretty was granted her freedom at the age of 61. Donna Hilton. Donna Hilton is another example of someone who took incarceration as an opportunity to turn their life into something more. She was convicted at age 20 of second-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping for her role in the rape, torture, kidnapping, and murder of a New York businessman. Donna grew up in a poverty-stricken and abusive household. Just before her 8th birthday, her mother sold her for a handful of money to a childless couple, Roy and Daphne Hilton. The couple took her to live with them in New York City and gave her the surname Hilton. But just after a year of being adopted, her adoptive father began to sexually abuse her on a regular basis, and later on she was abused by her math teacher. Later that summer, she fled to Philadelphia with an older man who promised to save her but sexually assaulted her in a motel room. They stayed together in Philadelphia for 5 months, during which he would force her to crawl on all fours and degrade her by urinating on her and burning her with a cigarette. He would assert his power over her by physically abusing her. In January 1980, they returned to New York, where she discovered she was pregnant. Enraged by the news, he insulted her and violently raped her. A year later, at the age of 16, she gave birth to a daughter. In 1981, she was forcibly taken by someone she had rejected and confined to a closet with a clergyman. They sexually assaulted her before returning her to the closet for 3 days. After being released, Donna reported the incident to the authorities. She also claims that one of the detectives who responded to her report assaulted her after taking her to an unfamiliar location. In 1982, she married a rapper at 18 and got pregnant, but he convinced her to have an abortion and then divorced her. After all of this, things only went downhill as she became involved in a cruel and malicious act of murder. In 1985, she met Louis Miranda through a co-worker, and he recruited her along with others to kidnap Thomas Vigliarolo. Thomas was a businessman who had previously worked with Louis. He believed that Thomas betrayed him and pocketed a significantly larger sum of money and gave Louis the short end of the stick. They kidnapped and drugged Thomas and held him captive for 2 to 3 weeks while he was starved, burned, beaten, tortured, and ultimately asphyxiated in a trunk. After they were captured by authorities, Donna claimed that she had been coerced into participating in the crime by Louis Miranda, who threatened to harm her 4-year-old daughter if she refused. Despite her defense, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping and sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison at just 20 years old. Donna expressed remorse for her actions, but maintained that she was not a murderer. She used her 27 years in prison to turn her life around and make something of herself. In 1992, she got her bachelor's degree in behavior science and a master's degree in women's studies and English literature from Marymount Manhattan College. Due to her past as a survivor of sexual abuse, she started working as an activist and advocated for the rights and well-being of women and girls who have been impacted by intersectional trauma such as sexual abuse, domestic violence, and human trafficking. She saw the state of discrimination in jails and also took on the role of advocating for prison reforms and speaking against gender inequality in American jails. But despite her successful rehabilitation into an educated activist, she was still denied parole the first time she applied. After she had served 27 years, she was accepted for parole. This decision did not sit right with a lot of people who claimed that the severity of the crime was too great, and she displayed a lack of remorse for her crimes. However, she was still granted parole as she had served more than her minimum sentence and had gone above and beyond to be a model prisoner. Hilton was released from prison in 2012 at the age of 47. Alice Marie Johnson. The case of Alice Marie Johnson made headlines because we saw big celebrities like the reality star turned businesswoman, Kim Kardashian, politicians, and even the president stepping in to make sure that justice prevails. Alice was born and raised in Mississippi as one of 9 children in a family of sharecroppers. Her life consisted of more hard work and fewer resources and money to spare. Her first pregnancy came when she was only a sophomore in high school. Before her incarceration, Alice left a strong impression on the vice president of FedEx, which led to a job offer. She worked hard and moved up the ranks, eventually landing a role in computer operations and later transitioning to customer support. Importantly, she actively fought for fair treatment of women and people from diverse backgrounds, lodging a formal complaint with the Human Resources Department. The company's top management responded positively to her grievance, resulting in significant policy changes. She worked there for 10 years before a gambling addiction and a boyfriend led to her being fired. Alice had taken an advance from the company for a work trip and lent it to her boyfriend. He did not pay her back, and because of her gambling addiction, she couldn't cover the money on her own, so she was fired. Things did not settle down anytime soon, as after a while she lost her son to a motorcycle accident, and she also went through a divorce with her then husband. She also had to file for bankruptcy, which led to her house getting foreclosed. After hitting rock bottom with nothing left, Alice took the first way out she saw: drugs. Alice became involved with a group of people who were transporting cocaine in Memphis, Tennessee. This drug trafficking ring was also linked to Colombian drug dealers based in Texas.
Everything was going out of control. I felt like I didn't control any part of my life. Bill collectors were calling. Every time they called, now that was the time that I went into the worst depression of my life.
In 1993, she was arrested with 15 others and later convicted in 1996 of 8 federal criminal counts relating to conspiring to sell cocaine and participating in money laundering. Alice claimed that she never directly sold the drugs, but rather acted as a messenger between the parties. Despite her claims, she was still considered the leader of the operation and was sentenced to life in prison, plus an extra 25 years in a federal prison without the possibility of parole. Alice had no criminal record prior to this, and this was her first and only conviction. Alice Marie Johnson showed exceptional dedication to personal growth and helping fellow inmates during her incarceration. She mentored, wrote plays, taught HIV/AIDS awareness, and became an ordained minister. She also organized a Special Olympics event and published a book of letters titled After Life: My Journey from Incarceration to Freedom. Alice was known as a role model inmate for her commitment to self-improvement and uplifting others. Her story gained the attention of reality star Kim Kardashian on Twitter. Kim was moved by her story and wanted to help Alice get out, so she enlisted a team of legal professionals, which led to a meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. She worked closely with Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and acted as an advocate for Alice's cause. Kardashian met with Trump at the White House to discuss sentencing and prison reform, and also gave media interviews to support Alice's plea for clemency.
It became this mission that I just didn't want to give up. I think to some people it might seem like, okay, Kim made a phone call to the president, showed up. We had been in talks and working on this for 7 months. And it wasn't an instant thing.
In 2018, Alice's sentence was reduced to 21 years in prison, and she was released from prison to be with her children and grandchildren. But she was not fully let off the hook at that time. Later in August 2020, President Trump granted Alice Marie Johnson a full pardon during a meeting in the Oval Office. Debbie Sims, Africa. Debbie Sims, Africa was an active member of MOVE, a black revolutionary and anti-technology collective, actively resisting the aggressive methods employed by the Philadelphia Police Department during that era during the 1970s. MOVE was established in 1972 in Philadelphia by John Africa and advocated for natural living and natural laws. Many of the clashes between MOVE and the city were the result of a racist criminal justice system, including police brutality and double standards of justice. On August 8, 1978, Debbie Sims, Africa was in the movie communal residence in Philadelphia with her spouse, Mike Africa Sr., and their 2-year-old daughter, Michelle, when the police surrounded the house and tried to evict the residents, and a confrontation ensued. 2 water cannons and smoke bombs were unleashed. Debbie and her daughter were trapped in the basement and had to escape in the dark. She was 8 months pregnant at the time and had to carry her daughter out of there. As the matter escalated, guns were fired, and one of the police, Officer James Ramps, was killed by a single bullet. The court placed the collective responsibility for his death on Debbie and 8 others, despite no evidence linking her, to the shooting or handling of a firearm that killed Officer James Ramp. MOVE members continue to insist that they had no workable guns in their house at the time of the siege, so the bullet could have been fired from their side, suggesting that a misfire by a fellow police officer may have been what killed him, but the court paid attention and claimed there had been workable guns there. Debbie was sentenced to 30 to 100 years in prison. Her husband, Mike Africa Sr., faced the same punishment. While in prison, Debbie Sims, Africa, gave birth to her son, Michael Davis Africa Jr., in September 1978, just a month after her arrest. She hid the birth from the prison guards for as long as she could because mothers were not allowed to be with their babies in prison. Her inmate helped her with the birth and cleaning up the placenta. She hid her son for 3 days in the prison. Whenever he would cry, a fellow inmate would cough or sing to cover the noise.
Because of the past, that wasn't always that wasn't always a city priority. That wasn't always, something that you could depend on at that point to not happen to a moved person, a moved baby, a moved, child. And so I was determined not to let them know that until I was ready for them to know.
And after 3 wonderful days, she told the prison guards about her son. They were shocked and quickly made arrangements for the son to be taken back to the outside world. She spent 40 years in prison away from her family and youngest son. In prison, she focused on keeping her reputation clean as a good inmate. She was committed to making use of the time she had and improving herself. She took on several things. She worked as a mentor to other prisoners and worked as a dog handler who trained puppies that assist people with physical and cognitive disabilities. She even pursued her education, a bachelor's degree in behavioral health from the University of Pittsburgh, and even went to get a master's degree in professional counseling from Carlow University. She conducted herself as a role model for other prisoners seeking self-improvement and maintained an unblemished disciplinary record. She had come before the board 8 times since she was eligible in 2008, and finally, after her attorneys presented the parole board with a 13-page dossier outlining her work as a mentor to other prisoners and as a dog handler who trained puppies that assist people with physical and cognitive disabilities, and a testimony from the correctional expert Martin Horn, who reviewed her record and approved, was she granted parole in 2018. Finally, at the age of 62, Debbie Sims Africa was released from prison on June 16, 2018. If you want to watch more videos like this, click on the video cards on your screen.